Smells like fall is in the air here in Michigan. Hello everyone, Dr. B coming at you from the sidewalk next to the East Lansing Public Library for this week's Sidewalk STEM. Yeah, so fall I feel like is just around the corner here in Michigan, which means a lot of things. And one thing it means is corn season and corn harvest and corn mazes, which are always so much fun. And that made me think today about corn starch, a product derived from the kernels of corn. And so I was going to open this up and do a little bit of a science demonstration and activity and try and unravel it a bit. A lot of you have probably played with this stuff at home or at school, this sort of cornstarch slime. And if you haven't, you definitely should try it. It's one of my favorite, most fun science experiments. It can be really messy though, so make sure you've got, the approval of your grown-up or your parent. You're doing it in a place that you can get a little bit messy as you're doing your science. But cornstarch is a powder. We use it for cooking. It's a thickening agent, and we'll kind of see why that is in just a little bit. But it is such a fine, fine powder. I mean, you can almost see it's much smaller than sand or sugar. The powder size there kind of goes right into your fingerprints there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take some of this cornstarch and we're just going to put it in a container. You could do this in a cup or a bowl or anything like that. We're going to put some there. And then you can see just how light and powdery it is. I'm going to take some water. This is just regular tap water. And I'm going to start to mix this in. I'm just going to go a little bit at a time here. And if you've got young scientists at home that you want to try this with, or if you want to try this yourself, you can sort of do some practice and measurement to see how much water should I put in. So you can measure how much cornstarch do you start with, and then I would add the water little by little and kind of stir it up. And it's going to become very difficult to stir. And then a little bit of water goes a long way in these mixtures. And if you talk to people that do this a lot, they all kind of have their favorite ratio of cornstarch to water. You can also just kind of wing it each time. We can see it's starting to change its properties. It's getting much gooier, but it's very, very hard to stir. You can see it's almost kind of like breaking apart and then kind of flowing back together, which is what makes this particular mixture, what chemists might call a suspension, so interesting. So I'm going to do a little bit more water, but I don't want to do much more because I think I'm right about at the perfect cusp here. A little splash in there. If you find that you put too much water in, if you're doing this at home, you can always then go ahead and add more cornstarch. You can kind of keep going. So this is getting a little bit liquidier, which is what we want. And so this is actually a suspension. The cornstarch hasn't changed. It hasn't chemically reacted into something new. It's still cornstarch. And if you were at last month's Wonder Lab on chemistry, we talked a little bit about that. So it's just suspended now in the water. And if we let this sit for a really long time, the cornstarch would eventually settle down to the bottom, the water would evaporate off, and after enough time we'd be back to sort of having just powdered cornstarch in here. And so here's what makes it really interesting. As I push against it, it's kind of resisting and breaking, it's kind of acting like a solid, and then when I stop, it starts to flow back together. If I try and jam my stirring stick into here, it barely wants to go in. It's like I'm sort of hitting a wall. But if I just set it on there without much pressure, it gets sucked in kind of like quicksand. And so this is what scientists would call a non-newtonian fluid. So you might have heard of Isaac Newton and his famous falling apples and his many contributions to science. Most fluids he would describe as, scientists call them today Newtonian fluids. They act like a liquid, they act like water. If we pour them, they sort of behave in predictable ways. Non-Newtonian fluids act kind of like standard liquids when you're sort of pouring them around. They act kind of like a liquid. But when you put them under pressure, in the case of cornstarch, and I'm going to grab some of it out of here, I'm actually going to start to put pressure on it all around, and I'm going to roll it into a ball. And this is what's so cool about this. It actually kind of becomes like a solid ball because I'm putting pressure on it here. And then when I stop, right when I stop, it starts to kind of turn back into a liquid, and it's flowing right back down, following gravity back down into the container, which is pretty cool. And it is very messy, but very fun, but water will rinse this off. If you do this at home, don't pour this stuff down the drain, because that can cause a little bit of a plumbing clog there. So you might want to let it evaporate out, and then you can put the powder in the trash. You can put the suspension itself in the trash. You can throw it out in your garden soil, get some more carbon and nutrients into there. I'm going to try this, I don't know if it's going to work. I'm going to let this spoon kind of get down into that. Then I'm going to see if I can try and lift it up. It actually ends up pulling the entire container despite how heavy it is, because it acts like a solid when I put that pressure on trying to lift. And it breaks a big chunk of it off. So very cool. Even if you've done that before, you might wonder, well, what's the sort of science behind it? Why is that? Well, cornstarch and many starches are polymers. They're like long chains of a chemical substance. So we've got lots of carbon rings in a polymer that make these long chain-like structures. And without much pressure, they can kind of flow along around one another, kind of acting like a liquid. But especially when you suspend them in water, and they start getting kind of like tangled up, you start to get these kind of like net chains. It's still cornstarch, but it's more likely that they're going to get all tangled up. When you try and push them and smush them down, you get these big kinks, and then when you're putting that pressure on, and that kind of resists the pressure and makes it act a bit like a solid. You can't really smush it as flat as you could if these paper clips were all unconnected or if they're all in single chains. But if you take pressure off, it'll eventually kind of flow in this viscous sort of way. So that's a little bit of the chemistry that's going on inside this otherwise very fun, very messy science experiment. But yeah, we'll be ready for fall here in just a moment. Corn's all around us. If you have some cornstarch, feel free to try this out. But make sure it is cornstarch. Corn flour, sugar, salt, those things aren't going to work, but you might try them to kind of see what sort of mixtures that they make. All right, well, this has been a blast. I'll see you next week for another Sidewalk STEM.